This morning I'd like to begin a look at the book of Mark, but we're not going to go verse by verse through the whole book, even though it is the shortest of the Gospels. That would still take quite some time to accomplish. So instead of tearing apart the whole Gospel, I'd like to look at 3 chapters or so near the middle of that book over the next several weeks. And these stories we're going to look at, they're significant individually, but they also fit together to serve a much bigger purpose. So that's the way I'd like to handle it as well. So it's just the same way that in our lives, we don't take one event of our life and explain it to someone without looking in depth at what came before it or what happened after it. It's like me telling you about what happened during my college years, but ignoring what happened in high school, even though high school is when I realized that I had an aptitude for math, and that was going to determine that in college I took math courses. And then it's the same way that if I tell you about my college years, but then I don't tell you about what came after, about graduation and my first accounting jobs, and then getting married and having children, my entry in the World's Strongest Man competition, and those kind of things. Making sure you're awake out there. Okay. Yeah, never happened. Never going to happen. You can't look at one story in a vacuum like that because it sells you short on the whole of Scripture. And it also sells you short on who Jesus is, which is why we have Scripture. So I don't want to come in here and play Bible bingo every week and we're not sure what's going to be on tap for the day, because by doing that we miss the bigger picture. So having said that, today we're going to look at the miracle when Jesus fed the 5,000. It's a very popular story, and I think a lot of that popularity comes from the fact that it is the only miracle performed by Jesus before his crucifixion that appears in all 4 Gospels. And to be honest with you, this passage that we're going to look at this morning in Mark, of those 4, is not the longest or the most detailed telling of this miracle, but I'm going to look at it again because it leads to our understanding of the Gospel of Mark and how it's put together. And it's equally important in understanding who Jesus is. So we'll look at Mark chapter 6 this morning, and we'll read from verses 30 through 44. The words are on the screen as always. Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, "Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while." For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep, not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. When the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away, that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." But he answered and said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" But he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5, and 2 fishes. Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks, in hundreds and in 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of His holy word. The beauty of most stories in the Bible is that there are multiple ways to look at them, and this one is certainly no exception. We'll look at a couple perspectives as we delve into this. First, though, to get an idea of the Gospel of Mark, you can basically divide it into three sections, and I have up on the screen for you. The first section tells us, it's about the first 8 chapters or so, tells us how the people wonder who Jesus is. And then you have the second part where the disciples wonder who Jesus is. And the third part is we finally learn who Jesus is. And you see up there under point number 1 of the first part, the feeding of the 5,000 is at the tail end of the section that tells us about the people wondering who Jesus is. So it's sort of like Jesus saying, okay, you want to know who I am? Well, how about this? And we're going to feed people with a lunch that is barely big enough for 1 or 2 people. Through the miracle of Jesus, He's doing a lot of things here, but really when we strip it down and get to our focus, He is teaching them what true discipleship is. And discipleship is simply the act of going under someone's authority in order to learn a doctrine. Jesus is using a real-life need here to illustrate this. Discipleship is the point. And we're going to look at 3 specific aspects of discipleship this morning. The first is that discipleship is about providing for and serving people. The second is that discipleship relies on the power of Jesus. And the last aspect is that discipleship is about love. So we'll look at these in turn, and the first is that discipleship is about serving and providing for others. In Mark 6, the people are hungry. So Jesus demonstrates the importance of providing for people in their time of need. Look at the contrast that we see in the writing here. In verse 34, we read, Jesus has compassion on the people, and He suggests they feed the multitude. But that contrasts with the disciples, who in verse 36 suggests they send them away and let them do it themselves. Now, I can't really fault the disciples too much because in part their concerns were practical. It would cost a fortune, or at least more than they had, to feed everybody, and they certainly didn't have those funds to do that, even if their hearts were in the right place. And they already admitted they were located in a very remote place. So where are you even going to find a market with enough food to feed all these people? You're basically out in the middle of nowhere. But do we see a bit of the disciples in ourselves? Do we simply look at the sheer facts of a situation and assume that's all that there is to it? Do we consider that maybe there's some other perspective that we aren't aware of? That is where faith largely comes into play. To illustrate this, stay with me on this, I'd like to talk very briefly about tax cuts. Yeah, there's going to be a connection here, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I don't know a single person who likes paying high taxes. And I laugh when I see these experts on TV say that our tax cuts are going to put our nation farther into debt. On the face, it makes sense, because if you're cutting how much is coming in through the rate, then yeah, you're not going to have as much money to spend. But there's another perspective that they aren't entertaining here. They aren't taking into account this phenomenon that occurs. Typically, whenever you lower tax rates, your businesses are paying less to the government, so they have more money to spend on wages, hire more people. You have more taxpayers who then make up for the difference plus some, typically. These experts are then left scratching their heads a year or two later, how did this happen? And I'm left searching for better experts the next time. These experts aren't counting on the expansion of the economy when they make their prediction, and the same goes with God's economy too. When we are faithful to Him, He more than makes up the difference. It's the same way that the disciples only expected a certain amount of food with the bread and fish that they had. They weren't allowing for God to multiply the food in the way He did. There's another way to look at this too. I wonder if these disciples would have been so eager to send everyone away if their families or friends had been among the multitude. We see that Jesus is willing to serve anybody, not just certain people. So do we give preferential treatment to certain individuals based on their relationship with us? Sometimes it happens. I mean, it's just natural. But how often do we only have the ability to help those close to us and not these others? Is it that we simply aren't looking hard enough to help more people? All that we need to do is follow the example of Jesus. Now, the second point this morning is that Jesus is more powerful than we give Him credit for. We just talked about the necessity to help others in their time of need, but I find it very fascinating how Jesus approaches this problem of feeding the people. Notice Jesus doesn't take control of the situation from the beginning. What happens first? The disciples come to Him with a problem. And Jesus has seen that a lot of times since then. Aren't we always taking our problems to Jesus first? It's how we pray often. So, what do you suppose the disciples wanted Jesus to do with this problem? Probably they were hoping He would agree with them and say, yep, it's time to send them home now. That way they won't be home too late and they'll get something to eat. Maybe they were hoping Jesus had some way to pay for the food. Maybe they were hoping He would pull out His American Express card, swipe it, and put it on His tab. Or if they didn't do that, maybe they would just be happy if Jesus told them what to do. Give them detailed instructions. Isn't that how it often is? That I don't want to figure this out. It's a lot easier if you simply tell me how to do it, and we'll save a lot of time in the process. Jesus doesn't make it easy on them because they wouldn't grow. And the same happens with us in our relationship. A lot of times He doesn't tell us exactly what to do step by step because otherwise it wouldn't stretch us and grow our faith. Remember that when they realized there wasn't enough food, this was right after Jesus was teaching. So, in a sense, this is like their homework assignment. He gives them a take-home exam to see what to do. But they come back to Jesus with the problem. And Jesus says, more or less in my words, weren't you just listening to what I was teaching? Now you should be able to handle this. So you figure out how to give them something to eat. This is then when the disciples give the excuses for not feeding the multitude. It's getting late, there's no markets around, we don't have the money. Do we see ourselves in this picture again? Are there times when we come to Jesus with excuses? How often do you hear Christians spend more time looking for reasons not to do something for the kingdom than actually spending the time searching for a viable solution? Imagine what change we would see in the church as a whole if people would change their focus in this way. We need to think, how can we do this, as opposed to, we can't do this because. This is where Jesus is drawing the focus. He's focusing on the things we have and not the things that we don't have. In verse 38, He asked them, how many loaves do you have? He asked, go and see. Now, it wasn't until I really researched this passage in depth for this series that those last three words, go and see, really jumped out at me, and that's why I entitled the message with those words. To me, these have a new meaning now. And Mark is careful to include those words too. He could have easily said, how many loaves do you have, he asked, and then go on. But he didn't. Jesus' word, go and see, when he says see, has a dual meaning here. Of course he wants them to go and look with their own eyes and see how many fish and loaves they have. but he also wants them to see the things of God to the fullest. This is the unveiling of one of the major threads that runs through the Gospel of Mark. Seeing, perceiving, understanding, however you view it, seeing the things of God. Now, I want to take a page out of the Mission Impossible playbook for a minute and tell you that your mission for this week, should you choose to accept it, is look at Mark 6, Mark 7, and Mark 8. When you read, pay special attention to instances where you see this word see. It shows up more times than not that it makes you realize this isn't mere coincidence. There's something going on here. In our lives, I think most of us have a routine on a daily basis, but through the routine, do we see Jesus working? He's much more powerful than we will ever know. And this miracle of feeding the multitudes, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more to come. So to recap, at first I said that discipleship is about serving people, and then I said discipleship is predicated on the fact that Jesus is a lot more powerful than we ever give him credit for. We've now arrived at the last point. Discipleship is about love. Jesus illustrates love through the mere act of feeding people who are hungry. They have a legitimate need. When they ate, also, this wasn't just a small snack to get them through until they got home. This was enough food to satisfy them. And we see that in verse 42. And when I say satisfy, I mean satisfaction like you have just eaten a Thanksgiving meal and you can't eat any more. That's what the love of Jesus does. It satisfies us fully and completely. And we also realize if we put ourselves in that situation, in that multitude, every single person there still had the free will to either eat or not eat or go home, try to find it themselves, do whatever. In the same way, those that we share the good news of Jesus with have those same choices. They can either accept it, reject it, just walk away. We have no control over their choice. All we have to do is be willing to offer it. On a day when people are so hungry and there's nowhere for miles around to get food, it would make sense to join in the feast and take what is offered to you. But oftentimes people aren't logical either. Maybe there's someone among that group who insisted on getting his meal because he's not going to accept any freebies. So off he goes. Maybe. That's how a lot of people react when they are confronted with the truth of the gospel. They would rather try it themselves rather than accepting the grace of God. But if they make that choice and they die in their sins, we know that they will be separated from God for eternity. There's plenty of Jesus' love to go around, but it's up to us to stop resisting God's call in our life. Do you notice, too, that after experiencing the love of Jesus, see how much food is left? More than what they started with. From a human perspective, it doesn't make any sense. I don't know how I would account for that on the books, I can tell you that. But it goes to show what happens when we rely on Jesus. He takes care of our needs with plenty left over. So if you want a fulfilling life, all you have to do is make Jesus the center of your life. Now, I don't want to say all you have to do, like it's so easy to do, but I say all you have to do because there's nothing else to do. That's the only thing, is make him center of your life, and that's through faith in Jesus Christ. And we see how being fulfilled does so much more for us than having a lot of stuff that we aren't going to take with us whenever we leave this world. It's about having our needs met and being content with who we are as a child of God. There's so much in this miracle that we haven't even talked about today. But I do want to close by saying that Jesus was showing his disciples, and by extension showing us, what is possible if we harness the love of God. First, we need to make the decision to help others rather than send them away unsatisfied. The miracle that Jesus performed was meant for them to see these possibilities and to see the goodness of God, and then followed it up by giving them the opportunity to put their faith into action. More importantly, we need to see who Jesus is. And again, we use this word see in the sense that we fully understand who Jesus is. Just as Jesus says, go and see, we also need to go and see a fuller picture of who he is. He is the one who fills our needs, the one who has compassion on us, the one who teaches us and does all those things. That's the essential part of a discipling relationship, a willingness to be taught and an eagerness to emulate what we've been taught. Jesus is willing to cultivate that in us if we would just let him into our hearts. We've seen the power of Jesus in this miracle today, and over the next few weeks we'll see more of what he's capable of, which gives us a better picture of who Jesus is. Let us now bow our heads and go to the Lord in prayer.